If anybody of you speak German and can read, you can have a copy of the last 3 issues of Brennpunkt Tibet. And in the last issue, we have also an article by Dr. Volker Stenzel. So the topic given here is the cultural diplomatic activities between Tibet and Central Asia through the ages. And actually, my presentation is just a short history of the cultural diplomatic context. I would like to thank you for giving my organization the opportunity to participate at this international symposium on cultural diplomacy in Central Asia and Caucasus, titled The Political, Economic, and Cultural Dimensions. Cultural diplomacy, as I understand it, is a strategy using, and all these codes, what I would have done here, I'm not going to mention specifically, are all from the website of the ICD. So code, powers of persuasion and soft power initiatives, decode, of an actor to strengthen intercultural relations as well as to promote the interests of the actor. In your search for a speaker in my part of the central world in Central Asia, you have come across with the works of Tibet Initiative Deutschland that is committed in campaigning for the human rights in Tibet and the right of Tibetan people to self-determination. We feel privileged to have caught your attention so that we can share our experience and perspectives with a wider audience. We also feel honored and encouraged to learn that you, again quote, appreciate the works of civil society as one of the tools to raise awareness to salient issues, decode. In the light of prevailing geopolitics, Tibet today has not only become a silent issue, but often a no-go topic on many international platforms. I'll come back later to this point at the end of my presentation. Tibet, geographically known as the roof of the world, and with its fantastic landscape and aura of seclusion, it had a magnetic appeal that spellbinds the minds of untold people across the globe from the 17th century onwards. The first king of Tibet, according to Tibetan historiography, was enthroned in 127 BC in the Yalung Valley in central Tibet. In the course of 2,000 years of statehood, Tibet experienced first hard and smart power. Tibet exercised first hard and smart power in political and military, and later soft power in religious, linguistic, and cultural fields vis-a-vis its neighboring countries. This is surprising because Tibet, as well as we all know, is landlocked and surrounded in most parts by impenetrable high snow mountain chains, which is called aptly by the inhabitants the land of snow. The relationship with her neighbors in the past, however, was not always peaceful. Like all nations in those days, Tibet too was a very belligerent state. When the first Europeans came to Lhasa in 1661, the civilization of First Nations in North America were threatened to extinction, and the mighty Inca and Aztec empires in Central and South America were already destroyed by the inquisitors. The last unknown region around the globe, like the vast Tibetan plateau beyond the majestic Himalayan ranges, captivated the fantasy and yearning desires of Western explorers, adventurers, religious seekers, and novelists. The myth of Tibet as Shangri-La was thus born, and many of the bestsellers further perpetuated this myth, making the Tibetans as the most peaceful people on earth. Such a blanket stigma can, of course, not hold entirely true. Since I assume that not all of you here today are well-versed with Tibetan affairs, let me first give you some basic facts. To start with, I will distinguish between a political, an ethnic, and a religious, linguistic, cultural Tibet. With over 2.5 million square kilometers in area, political Tibet that existed at the time of Chinese invasion in the winter of 1949-50 is 7 times bigger than the reunited Germany. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my laptop. I've got some maps, but I think we can do it without. It consists of 2 regions called Uyghur, Kham, and Amdo, and has some 6 million Tibetans as of 1959. Since 1965, this political Tibet is formally fragmented into 6 different administrative regions. Due to this politically motivated administrative act, over 55% of the Tibetans today live outside the Tibet Autonomous Region, one of the 6 administrative parts. According to a Chinese understanding, only the Tibet Autonomous Region is Tibet, which is the prime source of confusion with conflicting facts and figures, leading often to insoluble differences. Second, ethnic Tibet includes Bhutan, parts of Nepal, Sikkim, now India, as well as Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, Spiti and Kinnaur, all India. The third is much larger, as it encompasses Buddhist areas like Southern Mongolia, what's Chinese called Inner Mongolia, Republic Mongolia, as well as republics of Buryatia, Tuva, Kalmykia, all CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, as well as Swat Valley in Pakistan today, Gilgit, India, and Pakistan. One cannot rule out that in future traces of living Tibetan language and culture will be found in other countries of Central Asia like Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan. The classical Tibetan language developed during the imperial era from the 7th to the 9th century is today the lingua franca of the world of Tibetan Buddhism, from Beijing in the Far East in China to St. Petersburg in the far west in Russia, to the re-established great monastic universities in India today in the south, in the far south. My presentation today will be an initial attempt in trying to offer some secured facts and assumptions which I hope will be corroborated as facts in future through research that will form the groundwork on which concrete policies of cultural diplomacy could be formulated and implemented. The history of cultural exchanges between Tibet and the world can roughly be summed up in 3 periods viewed from a donor or a recipient perspective. The Yalung dynasty of 127 BC to 842 AD, Tibet essentially as being recipient. Period of political disintegration, 842 to 1249, and various dynasties, 1249 to 1959, Tibet essentially being donor. And since Chinese occupation and Tibetan diaspora, 1959, Tibet being both recipient and donor. Yalung dynasty. The first half of the Yalung dynasty still belongs to the realm of speculation, as we do not have secured historical facts. We now know that during the 28th king in the 4th century, the royal court of Tibet came in contact with Buddhism via Silk Road, which Dr. Stansel has already mentioned, and which was also the theme of his talk. By the end of the 6th century, Tibet finally entered the world stage due to the expansionistic policies of its 32nd king. During the short but fruitful reign of Songtsen Gampo, 607 to 649, Tibet rose up to become a military and political power in Central Asia, extending its political and military authority beyond its borders. He married first a princess from Nepal and then another from China, introduced Buddhism, and developed a new Tibetan script that is still in use today. Political and military hegemony of Tibet in Central Asia reached its climax during the 37th king Trizong Detsen, 755 to 797. A Tibetan army laid siege of Tang capital Xi'an in 763. But Masamba, tantric master, and Kamalashila, a learned scholar, both from India, came to Tibet in the second half of the 8th century and contributed vastly to make Buddhism the state religion of Tibet. Its first Buddhist monastery in Samye was built around 798. Although military expeditions were still continued during the reign of the 14th King Tirabelchen, 815 to 836, Tibet was increasingly becoming a peaceful nation. Promotions of Buddhism through the state and influence of Buddhist monastic institutions were at its height. Extensive new translations of Buddhist texts were carried out, old translations revised, and the entire Kangyur Buddha's words and Tengyur commentaries standardized and finally canonized. Hostilities between Tibet and China finally ended with the landmark Sino-Tibetan Treaty of 821. With the murder of Tirabelchen by the anti-Buddhist faction in 836 and succession of Langdama as the king of Tibet, Buddhism was severely suppressed. Langdama too was murdered by a monk in 842, and with it the Yalung Empire came to an end. In this phase of cultural exchange, when Tibet played rather a recipient role, a large number of Tibetans went to India to study at the great Buddhist monastic universities at Takshila in near today's Rawalpindi in Pakistan, founded in the 3rd century, and at Nalanda in Bihar, India, founded in the 5th century, as well as Vikramashila in West Bengal, India, founded in the 8th century. The contributions to Tibetan Buddhist culture, which is today one of the great world's cultural treasures, was made by hundreds of Indian masters, countless Tibetan disciples, some of whom were eminent translators. Buddhism, healing science, literature, language, art and culture, food, dress, architecture, and in fact every aspect of human civilization in Tibet were greatly or partly enriched through cultural exchanges with the neighboring states. I would like to single out here Tibetan medicine, one of the world's oldest known medical traditions. It is an integral part of Tibetan culture and has been developed from the pre-Buddhist era to this day. Tsewang Norbu invited great physicians from India, China, Persia, Eastern Turkestan, and Nepal for the first ever known medical conference of the world at Samye. To sum up this section, I will quote His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who used to tell that Tibetans have chosen the best for body, stomach, and mind from her neighbors, like dress from Mongolia, food from China, and religion from India. The second period, political disintegration and various dynasties. In the next 400 years, Tibetan Empire fragmented into tiny feuding principalities. Never again would Tibet regain its erstwhile military and political dominance in Central Asia. The restoration of Buddhism in Tibet began with the arrival from India of Adisha in 1042 in West Tibet. In the course of this revival, the political role of religious leaders like Sakya Pandita in the 12th century from the Sakya school increased tremendously. His fame even attracted the attention of the rulers of emerging Mongol powers. With their help, Sakya Pandita later became the new and undisputed ruler of Tibet. The first Yuan Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan made Pakpa, the successor of Sakya Pandita, in 1263 his imperial preceptor, and was even inclined to turn Sakya school as the sole state religion of his empire, only to be dropped up at the advice of none less than the Pakpa himself. Tibet now began to exert inner and spiritual rather than external military and political influence. The test of time shows that the soft power was going to be more lasting and sustaining than the hard or smart power, as I have seen myself vividly during my recent trip in the homes of rural peoples in Baikal region, Buryatia, and Mongolia. I assume that it will be similar in Tuva or Kalmykia, making these areas as, I quote again, cultural clusters sharing the same culture, values, and beliefs, quote, with Tibet. The Greek school, founded by Tsongkhapa in the 14th century, became increasingly popular among the Tibetans and Mongols. Altan Khan invited the third Dalai Lama to Mongolia, who was the most prominent religious figure of the time. The birth of the fourth Dalai Lama in the Mongolian ruling family further cemented this alliance. In 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama came to power in Tibet with the help of Mongol Prince Gushir Khan, which is to last till 1959. The alliance between the fifth Dalai Lama and Gushir Khan, like the earlier one between Sakya hierarchs and Yuan Mongol emperors, as was later between the Dalai Lamas and the Qing Manchu emperors, is called Priest-patron relationship that proved to be a very effective and sustaining diplomatic instrument. The great centers of Buddhist learning during this period were the Gelugpa monastic universities of Sera, Drepung, and Kanten in central Tibet, and Labrang and Kumpum in Amdo in northeast Tibet, that attracted hundreds of students from Mongolia, Buryatia, China, Central Asia, and Himalayas. Nyingma, Sakya, and Kagyu schools too had their own great seats of learning. The Chinese occupation and Tibetan diaspora. Shortly after founding the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, the PLA invaded eastern Tibet to drive out, I quote, this is not from your website, imperial forces, decode, from Tibet, and bring it back to the, quote, the big family of motherland, decode. The government of Tibet appealed in vain to the United Nations for help. On May 23, 1951, the Tibetans were forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement, in which China, among others, assured Tibet of having the right of exercising national regional autonomy. However, after the subsequent occupation, China did not keep her solemn promises. Although the Tibet Autonomous Region and other Tibetan autonomous prefectures or counties in Chinese provinces are autonomous, Tibetans have no or only limited powers to determine their own affairs. The decisions of power, for example, in the Tibet Autonomous Region, lies in the hands of the Communist Party secretaries, who never was a Tibetan so far. In the course of Chinese occupation of Tibet, over 1.2 million Tibetans died in prisons, labor camps, or famine due to torture, through execution, suicide, in resistance, etc. The tragedy of Tibet in the middle of the 20th century culminated in the abortive national uprising of March 1959. The darkest period in our history set in that led to the flight of some 80,000 Tibetans, accelerating the exposure of Tibetans to the modern world. Within a few years, Tibetan exiles reached Europe, Americas, Oceania, and Africa. From the mid-60s, an unprecedented wave of Westerners seeking meaning for life went to India and Nepal, where they also encountered Tibetan culture and lamas. The triumph of Tibetan culture in the world began in the mid-70s thanks to Tibetan Buddhism and to some extent to Tibetan medicine. A large number of Tibetan Buddhist masters of varying caliber came to the West. The 14th Dalai Lama is, of course, the greatest vehicle in transporting Buddhist culture to the world. In addition to Tibetan Buddhist masters, medical doctors, performing artists, thangka painters, writers, etc., are among cultural representatives of Tibet, contributing to a global understanding. By mid-1970s, Tibetan Buddhist centers began to be formed in West, grew like mushrooms through the 1980s, affiliated to various schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhist tradition, and Burn religion. Tibetan Buddhism has today a wide range of followers with varying biographic backgrounds. Most of them are sincere and earnest seekers of salvation, but there are also people who either follow Buddhist practices only out of intellectual curiosity or as a protest against non-liberal views of their parents, or relentless and desperate ones, changing from one religious belief to the next as commodity of daily consumption. Tibetan medicine has well-wishers and patients putting hope in it for relief. However, in Europe, it faces much more legal obstacles than in the religious field. Allopathy, or school medicine, backed by an all-powerful lobby of the mighty pharmaceutical and chemical industry, enjoys the exclusive right to exist. Fringe medicines are exposed to various discriminatory regulations. In Germany and in most other European countries where there is a comprehensive healthcare system, no insurance company recognizes the fringe medicine, and as a result, it does not pay whole or even part of the cost as it does with allopathic medicines. As long as this discrimination is not redressed, the alternative healing science will remain only a fringe medicine. Obviously, a good percentage of the patients hoping relief from Tibetan medicine has either no or already lost faith in allopathic medicine, or who are already given up by it. The later they come to Tibetan medicine for help, the less chance do they have being cured. Tibetan medicine can be a viable complementary healing science, and today the potentials of this medicine as a complementary healing system is being increasingly acknowledged by a growing number of patients and experts, both in the East and West. This is the donor aspect of Tibetan culture during the ongoing diaspora. As for the recipient aspect, during this period, modern education and confronting with democratic governance of the statecraft must be singled out. The exposure to a modern world catapulted them from pre-modern to modern age within a span of few years, with all positive and negative consequences. I will now try to sum up my presentation. Since the 6th century, Tibet posed a potent threat to all her neighbors. By 715, the three greatest expansionist states of medieval Asia, the Arabs from the west, the Chinese from the east, and the Tibetans from the south, had converged and were all vying for supremacy in Central Asia. Raiding and plundering, conquest by force and trickery, often through treachery, harsh and high-handed rule of hegemony were all short-lived. China often antagonized the subjugated tribes or nations, but mastered with great skill the art of sowing internal discord as a foreign policy tactic. Foreign rulers or religious leaders entering into official relations with China on an inferior to superior basis or receiving Chinese imperial titles helped them to mollify their internal rivals at home. Testimonies of witnesses of Tang China were all systematically and astutely brushed aside in the dynastic histories. Only in between the lines could one read that the proud Chinese had to silently accept the fact of equality with their ostensible inferiors or vassals. Today, the subjugated peoples of Tibet, Eastern Turkestan, called in Chinese Xinjiang, Southern Mongolia, suffer, I quote, internal colonialism, decode, because of, quote, structural and political economic, decode, inequalities within the People's Republic of China. The effect of these draconic political measures in the occupied countries amount to some sort of, quote, genocide, decode. The use of hard power to influence and coerce these people in order to achieve the objective of territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China does not, quote, promote trust and mutual understanding, decode, between them and China. The Cultural Revolution criticized two ethnocentric phenomena in China: Han chauvinism and local patriotism. The growing hard and smart power of China at home and abroad has reignited Han chauvinism, which in turn provokes local patriotism in the occupied territories. Today, China increasingly makes judgments on Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians based solely on, quote, norms or standards of Chinese culture, decode, amounting to cultural expansionism at best or cultural imperialism at worst. China uses her increasing economic and political power in preventing any discussion of 3 Ts: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. China also uses her hard and smart powers ever more aggressively in recent years in trying to curtail the movement of the Dalai Lama. Weaker states like Mongolia that succumbed in 2016 to the aggressive Chinese bullying only provoke further resentment and grudge in the hearts of the Mongolian people. I hope this international symposium will make a small contribution towards peace building and restoration of justice in these regions by use of soft power, diplomacy, and culture, as well as lessons learned from history, so that wrong approaches, as I touch in my presentation, will be discarded. Thank you very much.
The first question only.
Yeah.
First of all, again, it's a great honor to have you here. As I said, it's the first time I'm meeting somebody who worked with the Dalai Lama. I assume that for most of you as well. I admire, as I said earlier in our private conversation, your way, even if. I'm so sorry. Even if not, even if it's a harder way and a longer way, because you are not using hard power, your Bible, so to say, or your way of non-violence and the soft power should be a lesson to the world that I hope that someday the world will accomplish. In this sense, I'm coming to my question. I would like to know about what is the Tibet Initiative doing today, what is the civil society of the Tibetan are doing today. Do they work, for example, together with the UN, or do they try, and how do they work with the international community in order to try to accomplish or to get some kind of recognition and to try to start solving this issue of self-determination?
Yeah, thank you very much. At first, I just want to make one point clear. In the introduction, I think Mark said I was in Bundestag. I was not in the Bundestag. I was a staff of a member of the parliament. I just, not that you get an impression that I had been a member of the parliament. I just worked in the Bundestag as a staff of an MP and European MP as well. So just to make it clear. Yes.
The Dalai Lama, it's not important.
Yeah. Of course, I had the privilege of having very close contact with the Dalai Lama. It's probably thanks to Chinese policy. If I were in Tibet, I'm quite sure I would never have had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama and not to speak so near, so close to him. So in a sense, I'm thankful for Chinese actions, although it was at a high cost for the people, not for me. So, Tibet had, of course, hard power, as I tried to put it here in my presentation, in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, but it's long, long, long far away. And today, thanks to the Dalai Lama, his personal conviction that violence is not the way which will bring sustaining peace. The Tibetan leadership under the Dalai Lama has, since the 70s, given up violence as a means of political achieving political aims, and a lot of people try to say that Tibetan Youth Congress, for example, which I very much appreciate and I support, although I'm no more young now, say that Tibetan Youth Congress advocates violence. This is also not true. Tibetan Youth Congress doesn't advocate violence, but fact is, of course, you have members who do advocate violence. So, but not the organization. Now, the Tibet Initiative Deutschland, we do as far whatever is possible to try to bring the issue of Tibet to the German public, in the hope that this will be translated sometimes into German policy, and so that maybe at least the German government will do more to find acceptable solution to the question of Tibet. But as everybody knows, China's power, economic power, military power, and political power. China's political power was already, even when China was economically very weak, but very strong. And so today, China is using all these powers to make Tibet a no-go in all the international forums.
Yeah. I understand that in the national level,
yeah.
Germany and other countries, unfortunately, sometimes, of course, the economic and other interests are, so to say, overcoming other interests. But I was asking also, for example, in the case of United Nations and other international organizations who are supposed to be over the countries. Yes.
I think this is a great illusion, because United Nations for me is a interest block. In fact, interest group of powerful nations, particularly the five superpowers. So we don't entertain any illusion that United Nations would do anything for Tibet or others, because it's an interest group of so-called sovereign nations, and we have now, although I just don't want to go into yet European or Spanish politics, we've just seen what has happened in Spain, although I'm quite sure many people at the personal level, they have sympathy for the Catalans, but the European Union says no, yet. So the United Nations, and particularly with this terrible system of veto powers, I think we Tibetans never entertain any illusion.
So now I come to my next question.
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
Excuse me,
yeah.
but I mean the United Nations in 1960, 1961, etc.
That's true, but that's true. Even then, the 1965 resolution, in fact, was the best one. At least it explicitly recognized that Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. It's a big thing, but nothing has happened, and that was all.
Yeah, like always. Anyway. My next question. So we know and we understood that on the national levels, nations do not have interest to promote your interest.
Yeah.
On the UN, we understand a little bit that it will not come for them. So how about the civil society? What is going on today with this?
We do enjoy great sympathy among the people of let's say about German people, German civil society. But still, as long as the support of the German people is not converted into national policy, this doesn't bring that much effect in supporting the right of the Tibetan people. In fact, many of the Tibetans who are some sort of disgusted in because they say Tibetans are today the panda bear of the world. They are loved by all, but apart from this verbal sympathy, nothing happens. So this sort of thing is also going to turn a lot of Tibetans, as long as the current Dalai Lama is alive, they won't resort to violence. But once the current Dalai Lama is not there, then I cannot, I would say, I fear we cannot rule out that Tibetans also will start to violence. And this is actually the tragedy of our non-violent struggle.
Ignorant questions. I assumed that there are Tibetan initiatives not only in Germany but across the world.
Yeah.
Are you cooperating on an international level with each other? Can it become a body that will?
Yeah, thank you. Tibet Initiative Deutschland is part of the global International Tibet Network. I don't have the exact figure, but some years ago, all these initiatives around the world have over 2 million members. It's a huge thing. As far as for the Tibet Initiative here in Germany, we have over nearly 2,000 members, paying members, and over 4,000 supporters who now and then give either financial support or this support us in certain projects. And the biggest among the Tibetan organizations is the International Campaign for Tibet. This was formed in 1988 in Washington, D.C., and it has now branches in Amsterdam, in Brussels, in Berlin, and they have, it's a huge organization. They have over 100,000 members.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have a specific written agreed agenda of actions?
The aim of Tibet as initiative is to support the Tibetans so that they can have the right to self-determination. Once they enjoy this right, because the right to self-determination means you have the maximum succession or independence, minimum to join back to the Chinese. So Tibet Initiative doesn't say what the Tibetans should choose. They say it's up to the Tibetans to choose whether to remain within the People's Republic of China or to become independent. But Tibet Initiative will try to give find for the Tibetan people so that they can make use of their right to self-determination.
I will give other people if...
Yes?
Yeah, my question's about the Dalai Lama himself. I know as like a sacred tradition, he's supposed to choose the successor, or at least play a significant role in that. And I know as China already has kind of installed their own Dalai Lama, and they have kind of hijacked the process itself. So I was wondering, what is the tactic of the Tibetan people to kind of continue this tradition that is so important?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's going to be a very important question in the future. At the moment, you just said that China has already appointed one Dalai Lama. I think you mean the Panchen Lama. They have a Panchen Lama, Panchen Lama. So Dalai Lama is not yet. The fact is, Dalai Lama is the owner of this institution. So he has the right either to finish this line of institution, or he can say, I will be born in that and that country, which has been the cases in the past also. Now, first at the political level and at the theological level. Theologically, he can do it because it's his institution. He is recognized as a Dalai Lama, so he can end his institution. Now, what he has done is a political step. He said, on several times he said, I can remember in 1996 when he was in Cologne. At that time, this visit was organized by me. He said in Cologne, if that was the question from the audience, could you imagine that the Dalai Lama will be, the next Dalai Lama will be Chinese? He said at that time very clearly, if the Dalai Lama were to die now, I can guarantee that the next Dalai Lama will be Tibetan with rosy cheeks and with a lot of nose running, as Tibetan children have always nose running. And then he argued why. He said the sense of having a reincarnation is to finish the unfinished work of the predecessor, and not to destroy. So this is very important. And ever since, he has made several statements to the same effect. Now, interestingly, the communist Chinese who claim to be atheists, now they are very much interested in keeping the institution of the Dalai Lama alive. In fact, when the Dalai Lama said, I'm the last, and there will be no more reincarnation, they said, it's a blasphemy on his part to stop the institution from continuing. So it's quite interesting. It's like the Fidel Castro trying to elect the Pope. The atheist Chinese are more concerned about keeping the institution of the Dalai Lama alive than the Dalai Lama himself.
Is there a final question or comments?
Hello.
Yes.
You mentioned the Catalans before. You have a
Bit-
Catalan. You mentioned the Catalans before. You have a Catalan here in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to make fun, yeah, because now it looks like the people in the world are discovering that Spain is a very fascist, political tradition. We are joking in Barcelona. Why Puigdemont has to go to Brussels? He can go directly and wherever in Spain, where all the murdered people from the Republicans are dead. The Spanish government never looked there. They are forgotten people over there that they never checked. So it's the perfect place. It's where, by the way, we put the papers and the boxes to vote, actually, because I am telling you, they never vote there. I am working here at the ICB, and what you mentioned here, I'm a journalist and advertiser, okay? When you mentioned before regarding the UN, sometimes we are going over there, and I think I have a very close opinion about what you say. When I have been there, and I open my eyes because I am a very curious person, I discovered that you mentioned what they did in 1965. I am telling you that, in my opinion, right now, today, besides an tax avoiding society, it looks like for me it's just the playground for the non-important countries. Because the important countries that they are doing this in this world, they have the G20, the G8. But you have to make happy the other, let's say, poor countries and poor governments, so they have a playing ground so they can feel important. No? Everybody in his family, they have that. The father sometimes is doing this, the older brother, the younger sister. So I want to know if you agree with me in that point, and regarding as well that for me, United Nations end up when they do this in 1948. What they did something that I cannot really understand, but I understand because I also think on my own. They, in one hand, they did they declared Israel as a state officially, but in the other hand, the same year, they did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I don't understand at all, because when they declared the state of Israel, I'm sorry for the expression, they fuck up the human rights of the Palestinians. So, don't you think that this was just an invention for the Americans and maybe some people just to justify some things, and that's it?
Although as a Tibetan, I do not entertain any illusion that UN would do anything for Tibet. But at the same time, I do not look at the UN in that negative light. I think the root cause of inefficiency of the United Nations is this Security Council, the superpowers. I think they should have done 4-1 also. The concerned, they have no right to vote if the issue concerns them, direct or indirect. In that case, I think then the United Nations might work a little better. And the same we have also in the European Union. All countries have to, and I think it's slowly going to change. That means unanimous minus the concerned. That might help to make the United Nations a bit more effective and to be more to the aims and ideals of the United Nations.
Excellent. Well, on that note, please express our sincere gratitude for excellent keynote.